Bright QT. Every student matters.
Hello everyone. So let's start our next topic here, that is post-war recovery. But students, before talking about the post-war recovery, let us try to understand about which war are we talking here. So we are talking about the First World War, students. Now before this, you have learnt about the changes that were taking place in the 19th century, as well as we were also talking about the indentured labor migration. Correct? So we understood how indentured labor migration it worked, and who were these indentured laborers, and when was it abolished, what were the conditions of these people, and why were they chosen as indentured laborers, and so on. But here we are going to now shift our topic. Here we are going to understand about the First World War and what was its impact on Britain. So here we are going to talk about the post-World War recovery, and especially in context of Britain. Now why am I showing you this map here, students? Because when we are talking about the First World War, and I have repeated it so many times now, because you have learnt it in your first chapter, you have learnt it in your second chapter, here we have learnt it in the third chapter as well. Now in the fourth chapter again, we are talking about the First World War. Till now you must have remembered this, that there were two powerful groups. The first one was the Allied group and the second one was the Axis group. Now if anyone asks you this question, who was the victorious power, you can easily answer the Allied group. Here we are talking about Britain, right, in this group. Since we are specifying for Britain here, so we will talk about that. Now if we are talking about the Allied group, Britain, that is United Kingdom, France, Italy, and later on joined by many other, Russia and many other small regions, right? And when we talk about the central group here, we see Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, Turkey, all these, they were on the losing side, right? Now students, there is one thing that you must understand. Now when we are talking about the First World War, the impact of First World War, definitely there were so many. But the lives that were lost was uncountable, right? So many people, be it from the army, the civilians, they died in the First World War. Apart from that, we also see the impact of First World War in economy and also the social and political changes that took place after the First World War. Correct? So here we see that in the First World War, how was economy hampered? So in First World War, we are seeing that all these nations who are fighting among themselves, they had to buy arms, weapons, ammunitions, whatever you call it. And there was this defense expenditure, right, on a large scale. And also, this time the economy was good. Why? Because employment was on rise. Why? Because many people were now recruited in the army because they needed man force. They also needed people in this armaments industry in order to manufacture more and more weapons and so on. So this is how employment was a bit stable this period. But what happened after this? Because a lot of amount was invested in defense by each of these powerful nations. So here we are going to understand how they recovered from the First World War and basically the impact of First World War on Britain. So Britain faced a long crisis. Now why are we talking about Britain here? Because when we see Britain, already you have learnt a lot about the colonial rule that was started here, right? So in Britain, when we are talking about the period before the World War, pre-World War, we see that it was a dominant nation there, right? Colonial power, and how they were establishing hegemony in different regions, correct? So, after the First World War, Britain has to face a long crisis. In fact, there were industries that developed in the regions of India and Japan. Now, here we see that there is acute shortage, right? Because of declining economy in Britain. And therefore, seeing that situation, there were many new industries that developed in the regions of India and Japan. Now, Britain, because of this declining economy, they had to borrow loans from the US. US here is United States, and was later on overburdened by huge debts. Now, what are we seeing here, students? At first, they do not have sufficient amount, right? The economy is declining and they have to take loans from the United States. Now, one thing that we see here was that United States, it changed its position from international debtor to international creditor, because it was only in the end that United States had joined the war. So it did not lose much, but all these other nations, they had a lot to lose. And Britain had to face a lot of crisis, financial crisis in their own country. Now, war also caused an economic boom, like I told you. At the end of war, production declined and unemployment increased. Definitely, students, because all these nations, they were in huge debt. They had taken loans from the United States and the condition in their own nation was quite bad. Therefore, it led to the decline in production of all the goods, because industries were also hampered, and also it led to rise in unemployment, a state where people were not willing to work or they did not have any work to do, correct? It also impacted the agricultural economies. Definitely, here we were seeing that agriculture was once again in boom when we are talking about before the First World War, right? But later on we are seeing that agriculture economies are also being impacted. So when we talk about the Eastern Europe region, that was the supplier of wheat, and here after the war, what are we seeing? That in different regions of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, all these people who were living in this region, they started growing their own food, right? Because the Eastern Europe region was not able to supply wheat. Therefore, it impacted their agricultural economy, right? So, this is how people and the countries, they had to recover after the First World War. Now, coming to our exercise section here, the first question says, write the factors that made the post-World War I recovery difficult for Britain. Now, here what are we going to write? First, you have to talk about the First World War in small detail. You have to give about the First World War. Then you have to talk about how Britain had to face a long crisis. And why it had to face a long crisis? Because before the war, it was a dominant colonial power, but with the coming up of industries in India and Japan, it took time to recover, right? So the industries were also impacted in Britain, and this is how they took time to recover and establish their domination again in the world trade. Also, they had to take loans from the US, that is United States, right? So these are some of the important points that you have to mention here.